I'm Sarah Kendzior, the author of the bestsellers The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight, and of the new book, They Knew, How a Culture of Conspiracy Keeps America Complacent, which is out today, so you can go ahead and get that now.
And I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones, the film the Kremlin doesn't want you to see, and we know this because it keeps shutting down screenings.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the United States and rising autocracy around the world.
And today we're joined by a very special guest, my co-host, Sarah Kendzior, the author of her latest book, They Knew. This interview begins as a dark and stormy night. This is the closest, Sarah, that you'll probably ever come to writing a Stephen King novel, only it's real and it's about American history.
Yeah, I mean, my dream is that for all of our predictions that we've made over the last 4 years together to be wrong, and for the United States to, turn into a true democracy. And then I will actually write a fictional Stephen King type novel. But yeah, for now, unfortunately, Hiding in Plain Sight and They Knew will have to suffice for that.
Yeah. And so if you're into gothic ghost stories, if you're into travel journals, if you're into haunted American road trips, this is the book for you. It is a page turner. It is gripping, and it's filled with real life monsters, which is a chilling reminder that throughout American history, Donald Trump has been the norm.
Absolutely. You know, like when I started this book, it was around spring of 2021, which meant I had been writing, for the public about Donald Trump for about 6 years. And I was incredibly sick of writing about Donald Trump. I was incredibly sick of explaining to everyone the things that, we have been explaining on the show for a long time. His background of criminality, the cohort that surrounded him, the transnational aspect of it, and just the sociopathic evil of it all. And then what, Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, the enablers, the people who just stand there and watch the cruelty and watch the suffering as a result of that cruelty and do nothing to stop it. That's at the heart of every horror story. And I think grief is at the heart of every ghost story. And so this is a sort of nonfiction ghost story about America. But when I started the book, it was really hard to get going because the last thing I wanted to do was write another Trump book. So I was stuck with this question of this is obviously on the forefront of people's minds. We're still contending with the same problems that we had when he was in office. It's not like any of this went away. We were haunted by it. So with the first chapter, which was excerpted in Vanity Fair last week and is actually going to be today's Patreon bonus. If you're a Patreon subscriber, you can listen to, a large part of that first chapter.
Gut-wrenching. It's so disturbing. It's like you could sell that chapter to American Horror Story, Ryan Murphy, or the
definitely.
Black Mirror folks.
Yeah, and it's the story of a man, who lived in the 1920s and 30s, a con artist, a murderous con artist, very much like Trump. And so without giving too much away, I tried to tell the story of Donald Trump and his rise without actually speaking about him directly until much later, because that's the true horror of Trump, is that he's not this singular figure. He's had predecessors and he will have successors. And he is the culmination of, I think, American political tendencies that have been there, since the founding of this country, with truths and buried secrets that we've never really reckoned with and that we're reckoning with all at once right now. And so, yeah, it ended up being a really weird book. I remember telling you this as I was working on it because it was difficult. There were some chapters that just sort of poured out of me, like the first one. And I remember I wrote that and I thought, my God, like my editor is going to kill me. Like everyone is expecting, Hiding in Plain Sight 2 or whatever. And here I am with this story about a haunted hotel in northern Arkansas and this sort of like freewheeling travel narrative. But, it came from the heart. It's a very 2021 book. And I kept thinking about that. I kept thinking about how there's so little art from the period of the Spanish flu. When we were hit by COVID, everybody was taken by surprise. They didn't really know how to process a pandemic. And so I kept kind of looking into the past, like, what did other great writers or artists or, even filmmakers at that time have to say about it? And you really don't see a hell of a lot. It's an episode of history that people wanted to forget. And I couldn't figure that out because in 2020, it was, it dominated everything. It was so singular. By 2021, I was like, yeah, I want to forget this shit. Like, I want to forget that this ever happened. I don't want to think about the trauma. I don't want to think about the grief. I don't want to think about the loss. But unfortunately, I was contracted to write a second book. So I had to write something in the midst of that loss. And then I thought, this is actually valuable. Like, I wish there had been, seminal books written in 1918 by somebody living in 1918 who would rather be living at another time and who would rather be writing about other subjects besides, say, World War I and the Spanish flu and the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment and the rise of white mob terrorist race riots and, all these very similar things to our time that were happening then. And so, the book is kind of bracketed in that time. It's the story of 2021. You probably noticed from the author's note, the very last day I made edits was the beginning of Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. And I remember thinking, my God, like we're reliving all of the worst moments of history. And now I'm ending on this note. And I honestly didn't know what the world would be like by the time it came out, or honestly, if it would come out, or if I would still be here when it came out. So it's been a nerve-wracking experience. And I didn't want to lie about that. But I also wanted to showcase it in a way that was more palatable for people. So there's a lot of lyrical writing, I guess. I mean, I feel weird talking about my own writing. Folks can just go and read it for themselves. But, if you've read my other stuff, if you've read View from Flyover Country or Hiding in Plain Sight, it's more in the vein, I think, of View from Flyover Country. And I just kind of like let loose. I really cut loose with this book, which is why it's, I think, kind of a strange one. Hopefully a good one. Hopefully y'all like it, but it's true to my heart. And I think that that's the most important thing, is that you tell the truth and that you also, you speak with sincerity, try to come from a pure place when you're writing a book about a time in which so many people are suffering.
No, you were very much in the zeitgeist of the times of wilding out.
Yeah.
After the plague comes the wilding out. And that's wonderful. But, it's like all of us have been through this collective hell, this collective trauma, and that brings this instant intimacy. Like we know from, anybody we come across, like it's just this shared recognition of when you say, hello, how do you do on the street or in a meeting? Behind that is we're going through hell. We're going through mass trauma. Let's all carry each other through it. And so you can very much just let loose now because people basically have a collective attitude of fuck it. And that's very much the spirit of this book. And I'm so thrilled to see it. I would just say View from Flyover Country was your blues album. Hiding in Plain Sight was your death metal album. And They Knew is your Vincent Price narrated thriller music video.
Yes, but possibly. I have to say, it's so funny when I read reviews of my work because I get a lot of she's like a beat poet or a blues singer or a gothic novelist. And I keep thinking about all the people who are constantly asking me for solutions. And I'm like, do you ask the beat writer or the beat poet or like the blues singer or the gothic novelist for political solutions? Is that really where that person's expertise lies? Or is that person's expertise more conveying the reality of the situation? Like it's such a bizarre situation to be in. But yeah, the masks are off now, I think, in various ways. In 2021, it was such a strange year because it began with this note of timid optimism, both about the Biden administration and also about the possibility that COVID was going to leave us. And there was a lot of anticipation about the summer, this being the summer that we finally sort of feel, quote unquote, normal again. And then it was devastated. And as I point out in the book, the devastation, of course, was rooted in my state of Missouri, the bellwether of decline, which, produced the Delta variant. And then that set off all the other variants. And, that's why we're in the hell that we're in now. What happened after was just so much cruelty from so many different people. And I think it's a result of trauma. So I try as much as I can to not judge people who are writing just really generalizing, demeaning things, blaming people in various parts of this country or cheering on death if they thought at that point that, if somebody got COVID, they would blame them for it when it often was not that person's fault. And also it's just gruesome and disgusting, I think, to root for anyone's death except Henry Kissinger. And so it's like all these kind of competing characteristics were emerging. Like, are we going to be compassionate to each other? Are we going to have sort of like radical empathy, as it's called? Or are we going to be violent, as was the aftermath of the Spanish flu? And, that turned out to be the answer. What I'm noticing now, especially from people in positions of political power and in the mainstream media and whatnot, is that the masks are off and underneath them is just a hood. We're seeing a very overt embrace of fascism, and fascism being portrayed as the way to get back to normal. They're bringing back the mentality of 2015, 2016, where autocracy is treated as entertainment. Only we've actually lived through a proto-autocratic administration with the Trump administration. We have witnessed a cavalcade of crimes, them letting COVID spread unimpeded, an attempted coup, multiple acts of obstruction of justice, stealing nuclear secrets and hiding them in the basement of a Florida golf course. And then, these useless explanations about why none of this has been resolved, all of which avoid the key component, which is the title. They knew, this is a book about complicity. It's a book about people who stand by and let terrible things happen to other people. And it's a book about helplessness and powerlessness. And I don't want people to feel helpless and powerless when they read it. One of the nicest things people write to me at points, and, we both get this about Gaslit Nation, is, thank you. Now I feel less alone. I feel less like I'm the only one seeing this. I feel less like I'm going crazy. I know that this honestly is as bad as it seems. And so, okay, now let's work on how we're going to get through this. And that's not necessarily having a pat, easy solution to things. I think that's really hard. But kind of psychologically, like, how do we persevere? How do we remain resilient? That's what I want to get out of it. I know at some point you asked me a question and I completely forgot what it was. So this is a classic Gaslit Nation episode.
No, but it's true. Like, but how do we remain resilient? Like, how do we persevere? What did you get out of that from all of your travels across the US?
Yeah, I realized recently that I have now lived longer in the 21st century than I have in the 20th century. And that was such a strange realization to have. I just had this birthday. I keep wanting to say 29 because that's the lie that I taught my children
You're
to tell
forever
everyone.
29.
Yeah, it's getting really hard because I have a 15-year-old daughter. A little question there. But, I turned 44. And so that means, I was born 78. So I spent 22 years in the 20th century and 22 years in the 21st century. And I was, thinking to myself, which was worse? Because really, it's such a clear demarcation point. Like, everything truly went to hell starting in the 21st century, starting with 9/11, the war in Iraq, the financial collapse, the lack of a recovery for it, incredible income inequality, wealth hoarding, opportunity hoarding, entrenched and unimpeded corruption, and digital technology, tech companies and quote unquote innovations that I think have made our lives tremendously worse. And I'm just going to warn everybody, like, I have been having my book's about to come out, nerves. And so to calm my nerves, I've just been scrolling around all the streaming sites and, there's not a lot of good stuff on. So I ended up watching Manhunt Unabomber and then the Unabomber documentary, because the thing is I'm trying to figure out if I or Ted Kaczynski is the most famous Polish American author, political author in recent history. There's really not a lot of us. There's this category on Amazon that's like radical political thought. And I'm always like next to Kaczynski. And I'm like, big day for the Polish Americans, living in states that begin with M, writing books about conspiracies. Anyway, sorry, Unabomber's bad. Don't bomb things. Although, his manifesto is, in many ways accurate, minus the sexism and racism and call for violence. His critique of technology, his critique of industrialization, his critique of environmental devastation, a lot of that panned out. And if he hadn't been the subject of a bunch of MK Ultra experiments when he was at Harvard, he may have made a really positive contribution to the world.
Oh, you didn't know that? Oh
my
yeah.
Okay, so just so you know, so in one of the many threads of conversations Sarah and I have, typically off the show, because it's just weirdness takes over sometimes when we're chatting, is MK Ultra, which is a decades-long mind control experiment led by the CIA, which included giving LSD to unsuspecting people around the United States.
Kaczynski was one of the first people to have the enhanced interrogation, quote unquote, it's a very euphemistic term, the torture tactics that the CIA used. They tested them out on Kaczynski and other Harvard students while he was at Harvard, and they broke him. They absolutely broke him psychologically. And obviously there's no excuse for bombing innocent people and killing them. And I was really deeply moved when I watched the documentary about his brother, David Kaczynski, who's just this incredibly admirable, compassionate person. He's also the person who had to turn his own brother in, and live with the weight of that. But he described how, he was a weirdo. He was a math genius. No math genius is like, tends to be a quote regular person or whatever. But Harvard broke him. I mean, this may seem off topic, but a lot of this kind of discussion is in They Knew. I go into all these things that people, they think they're so outlandish, claims about MK Ultra, claims about various state crimes and government conspiracies, including the ones, that we talk about on the show with, Trump's links to international mafia, the Jeffrey Epstein case, the predecessors to the Jeffrey Epstein case. When we tell people, they're always like, that's insane. I should have known that. And the thing is, like, you and I, given our interests, we should have known this about Ted Kaczynski. You would think this would be a more widely reported piece of information about his background. But, I didn't know it until relatively recently. And I only heard the actual tapes, parts of them, of him doing this to him at Harvard recently. And of course, this fits into, Harvard's long reputation as a place that produces, creates, and hires absolutely terrible people. But yeah, anyway, I think that my point was that the 21st century has been a very dark time. We have seen the world globally shift from democracy or fledgling democracies into authoritarian states, semi-authoritarian states, and even Russia is moving towards being a totalitarian state. And the United States, of course, is moving either towards full autocracy or, civil war, and not in the traditional 19th century sense, but more of a series of terrorist acts mixed with secessionist movements. These are all things I'm deeply worried about. And it's being this age at this time, knowing that my life is more or less probably more than halfway done, actually, because life expectancy is dropping rapidly in recent ages, but I am raising children, and I'm sort of trying to take a long view in what seems like a existential threat. It's a weird thing to have to do that. So of course I'm thinking about, resilience and perseverance, but I'm also just thinking about one day at a time. Like, what do I teach my kids while I have them? What can I do for future generations now? And, a lot of what I try to do, and we both try to do, is debunk propaganda, bring people the truth, bring people the true history of this country so that they're not so taken aback by all the horrific things that happen. That doesn't mean you don't react emotionally to it. Like, I react emotionally. I cry when awful things happen. I cry when people are suffering. Like, knowing the historical, precedents for horrific events, it doesn't make those events any easier to handle on an emotional level. Like, you still react the same way. And in fact, the more the deeper the horror goes. And I know you know this with Ukraine, because you've spent so much time studying the genocide in Ukraine. And then now you're seeing it happen again, which is just it's a nightmarish, horrific feeling. And so for the United States, what's happening now, it has all these precedents, which I get into, especially in terms of government conspiracies against the American people. But to have them all happen at once and have them happen in a digital era, that is new. We are dealing with a lot of crises that are just unprecedented in the history of humankind. And we're dealing with forces that want to make us less human, that in some cases, in extreme cases, you kind of look at like what Peter Thiel is up to, you look at what Jeffrey Epstein was into, people who want genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, but also just a dehumanization that I think comes from the architecture of social media sites and the internet, this decontextualization, mass bullying, a way that cruelty has been normalized where people just say the most abhorrent, awful things to people, intentionally trying to bully people to suicide, all this awful stuff. And then also bots, and then people who are indistinguishable from bots, people who are in, quote, stan culture, who worship a celebrity or even worse, a politician, and they subsume their identity in that. Like all of that to me is really alarming. And at the dawn of the 21st century, that was the most optimistic I ever was in life, was like in 1999 when I was, 20 years old. And it seemed like the world was moving in this amazing direction. Like I loved the internet. I was an early person on the internet because I felt like I could connect with other like nerdy people who had my interests, which I describe in the book. And there's so much techno optimism. There's such a sense that if we could just be able to communicate with each other, then we can work out our problems. And that if people from repressive states had a voice, if they didn't have to rely on like samizdat type, very difficult print technologies as they had in the 20th century, then they would have, revolutions, or they just would be able to reveal the truth about their political conditions. And as a result of that, their political situation would improve. And all of that proved to be wrong. Exposure doesn't do anything when people don't have shame and when the people as a large body don't have leverage. And we've lost leverage in elections. We've lost leverage in protest. We've lost leverage in almost every form, except I think in documentation and kind of like relentless, refusal to bow down to an official narrative. It's hard to do. Like when you're witnessing things with your own eyes and ears, you see them clearly and they're abhorrent and you do deep research into why they're happening. And that you might not have all the answers, but you're at least asking the right questions. And then you're dismissed, as alarmist or hysterical or a conspiracy theorist. It can be demoralizing because that online culture I was talking about before of, bullying mobs or conformists, that they're all aimed at you. And so one thing I'm hoping with this book is that people they feel like they can shrug off that stigma. Like, I don't want people to worry so much about what other people are calling them. I don't want them to worry so much about their career in the sense of like, oh, I need to be respected by quote unquote respectable people. Because respectable people are often, evil people. Bill Barr is respectable. A lot of, not really Trump's lawyers, but a lot of these, legal types or cable news pundits that lie to us, they are the respectable people. The New York Times is respectable. The New York Times has been respectable and supporting Hitler and supporting Trump and supporting dictators and covering up state crimes for a century. Like, respectable is not a thing to aspire to. Being honest is a thing to aspire to. Being compassionate towards others is a thing to aspire to, and it's absolutely not encouraged. And so, I wrote a weird book, it like kind of, slides all over the place and, has a large array of different subject matter. And it does devote 5 pages to a spinoff of the X-Files. But nonetheless, I think weird is good. Like, it's okay to be genuinely weird, not like 1990s where, checking the alternative music box, like wearing flannel stereotype. Gen X commodified weird, but like genuinely willing to just be your own person and not spend your life trying to create an online persona or even a real life persona for the benefit of others. I hope our culture moves in that direction because I see competing forces. Like you said, folks are wilding out and there's potentially good in that. There's potentially a kind of freedom in that because people realize that these institutions that they formerly trusted or were taught to venerate have betrayed them. So why should they work for them? Why should they, risk catching a virus or be content with poor pay or whatever for this system. And that part is good. But then I see the other part really buckling down, closing ranks, trying to reaffirm its might and power. And it's very frightening to me that that is happening under a Democratic administration, one that has the potential to try to bring accountability and truth to the American public, and I give examples towards the end of the book of times in history where that has happened, and it has worked. It has shifted American culture for the better, American political culture. They're not doing that right now. They're acting very timid and hesitant, and they're acting like it's a foregone conclusion that we will become either an autocratic state or a collection of partitioned autocracies. That's how I feel the media and a lot of our political officials are behaving. And I don't know if it's because they truly believe that this is the inevitable outcome and they'd rather remain employed in those circumstances, even if it means they're employed as cheerleaders of fascism, or whether it's something they're trying to cultivate, because a lot of this is led by money, by CEOs, by people with interests that are not ever in the public good. They are class interests, and that class is like the 0.0001%. Either way, it's frightening. So I hope that folks, in a time of great understandable fear and trauma, can still hold on to their moral core and their sense of individuality, because I think that more than anything will get you through this time, will make you feel resolute during this time.
Wow, wonderfully said. And I think one of the interesting things you've always shared with people on the show, Gaslit Nation, which you're all listening to now, or on your Twitter account and on Facebook, is your travel. You love to travel on road trips across the U.S. I've been with you driving in Missouri, and you've pulled over the car to take photos of the light hitting some old abandoned house in some beautiful way. And then you'll post photos like that to online. And it's just such a nice little travel journey. And you'll share stories of little bits of Americana history, odd things, eccentric things that are just give so much flavor to the variety of our country and its rich history and silly history and dark history. And this is what's really wonderful about They Knew is it feels like traveling with you, and you let people into that world, which I think is an incredibly rich experience. Because I think it's a big testament to you that you have such a passion for these road trips. And I always wanted you to do some sort of travel series, like watch America while you come see America while you still can.
Yeah, I'm hoping, for the next book, and I guess we're going to break news on this show. I am contracted to write another book after They Knew. So something will be coming out, and I do want it to be that. I'm not going to give full details of what I want to do, but it will be a travelogue or travel related of some kind about America, historically and in this time. But yeah, part of this is, I've always loved to travel, like since I was able to. I honestly didn't much as a kid, and I got restless. And so the minute I was like 17 and in college, like anywhere I could go, I would go. And, my ex-boyfriend, when I was in college, he lived in Lubbock, Texas. And I remember him saying, you are the easiest person to please, because we went to Super K, to Kmart to get some ice cream one night. And I was like sitting in the parking lot, and I'd never been, to West Texas before. And this is like Lubbock, which smells like cow manure on regular intervals in like the late 1990s. And I was like looking up at the stars and at like the incredible expanse of this Kmart lot. And I was like, my God, this is so beautiful. Like, it's so amazing here, because I never seen that much space, growing up, in central Connecticut, an industrial corridor of Connecticut, like I did. And he was like, my God, like, you are the cheapest state and the easiest person to please. And we, and then that was the first time I really kind of explored the, that part of the United States. Like, we drove to New Mexico, we drove to Colorado, and I felt so free. Like, I felt so, I don't know, just curious about everything. I wanted to stop and look at everything. And, I love this country so much. And it was right after that, I went abroad for the first time. I never left America until I was 20. And I went to Vienna for a semester. And so, that was huge culture shock. I had studied German, so it wasn't a language thing. It was just like being outside of America. And it made me realize like how deeply American I am. And I don't necessarily mean that in a flattering way. I mean, like, I like McDonald's. I like pro wrestling. I like arena rock music. I mean, honestly, I have a lot of the interests that the Trump campaign tries to tap into, like those very typical kind of trashy American ways of being. Like they're smart to do that. And if I didn't see right through his incredible bigotry, corruption, and evilness, maybe I would join that team. I mean, culturally, my tastes are very much more in that field, and my politics are the exact opposite. But, it just sort of solidified that to me. Like, this is my home. I love visiting other countries. I enjoyed living in other countries when I did so, briefly. I lived in Turkey for a year, lived in Austria and in Kyrgyzstan, for about, I don't know, a third of a year each time. And it's great. And I've been to a lot of countries, and it's awesome to see them. Much harder to do it now with COVID. So I'm glad I did that back then. But, this is my home, and it's a part of me. I feel like it's in my blood. It shapes my mind. It's how I see the world. And that will never change. Like, it's so deep to me. It's like my family comes first, and then my writing, and then, this country. And I'm not saying that either in some sort of hagiographic way, like America is so awesome, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, honestly, I'm known for criticizing it, but I criticize in that way, James Baldwin wrote about, where he said, I love America so much, I feel obligated to criticize it relentlessly because, I love it in a personal gut level. I grew up here way, but also it is disastrous, especially at this moment. And it's full of historical injustices that were never remedied, that can be remedied and must be remedied for our survival. And so I want that America, that vision of America, that idealized America to exist too. At the same time, I just like to drive around looking at stuff. I live in Missouri, and I've lived in Missouri for 17 years, and it's the literal center of the country. So when my family goes on a road trip, we drive in every direction. We went to the Dakotas and Michigan. We drive to Texas. We drove to the Southeast. We drove to Connecticut. We drove to, New Mexico and Colorado and the national parks and Montana. Like we've driven basically everywhere except for, I guess, the West Coast, because it was just too long a drive with 2 little kids, and we didn't have enough money or time. My kids have seen, I think, 36 states at this point. And it was really important for me that they see how Americans actually live, and that there is no quote unquote real America, that urban and rural areas are equally real, that a Native American reservation and a majority Latino, historically Spanish speaking city and, a small town in Missouri, like they're equal. They're all part of our heritage. And I don't want them to buy into stereotypes, because I see them plastered all over social media and all over the news, and all this very dangerous, divisive rhetoric about secession. And I write about that, especially toward the end of They Knew, in pretty personal terms, because St. Louis, at the border of Illinois, is historically the focal point of where wars break out. This is where Huck and Jim went down the river, on this literal border between a slave state and a free state. And you make the wrong move, and you're, sold down the river. Like, it's always been contested territory. And I would include a lot of the surrounding states in that, like, Illinois has always been contested, Kentucky, Tennessee to some degree. We're not completely unique, but we always been kind of at the heart of this conflict. So when a lot of people say, oh, the red states should secede, or the blue states should secede, and they try to present it as simple, it's bizarre to me. Living in a very liberal, heavily Black city represented by Cori Bush in a state that's, a GOP hijacked state, run by a group of deeply corrupt, radical right-wing Republicans, including the insurrectionist Josh Hawley. And then, people act like those are two things that somehow, you have to choose one or the other. I mean, I don't know. They label both in different ways, but it's like, it's never lost from my mind that I can literally walk across a bridge. Then I'm in Illinois, and I'm in a quote blue state, which of course is not blue. If I walk across the bridge into Illinois, I'm actually walking into a county that voted for Trump, unlike the one I live in the state of Missouri. So all these things are more complicated than what they seem. But I do know that people look down on me for living here. And I think it's very strange that if I just walked 25 minutes over into Illinois, that I maybe would be greeted with more respect, or I'd be assumed to be liberal for people who don't know anything about me beyond that I live in Missouri, and all this kind of stuff. It's important to me that not just my children, but I wish other Americans would, I don't know, really explore this country. And I know right now it's a very tough time to do that. It's a tough time to sort of open your eyes and open your heart to what's there. And you will witness a lot of really horrific things. You'll witness horrific things throughout history, and you'll witness horrific things happening now. But, it's a deep love. It's kind of inexplicable in some ways, but it is there for me. And so if I can bring that perspective to people, including to people who live outside America and, want to know what it's, quote, really like. And like I said, there is no what it's really like. It's different through everyone's eyes. But my eyes see in all directions due to living in the center of a country that does not hold. So hopefully something useful of value is provided there.
I would say there is. Catherine Deneuve, she went on a road trip with a friend of mine across the U.S. My friend was a publicist during the Mad Men era. And Catherine, when she visited the U.S., insisted on doing a Sarah Kendzior-style road trip where she would go to all these little gin joints and holes in the wall and roadside stands in search of Americana. She was obsessed with it. So I feel like she would really get a kick out of your book. The other thing I wanted to comment on is circle back to earlier in our conversation when you talked about the generation of the Spanish flu, which was right smack on top of the Great War, World War I, and how the artists of that age, how there was this silence of the gruesomeness of that time, the mass death. And it's really interesting because the writers that came out of that generation, of course, famously Hemingway was somebody who is famous for the iceberg theory, where you have so much that's unspoken in life in between characters and the richness in that silence. And I just think it's so interesting how that must have been shaped by all the horrors that he endured during the war and in the aftermath of seeing just the world imploding. And that, in turn, the times we're living in is shaping all of us as creators, as thinkers, whatever our craft is. But I do want to talk about the creative influences when you're working on this book. For me, it's obvious Stephen King, because you're a huge Stephen King fan. And this feels like reading a Stephen King novel, only richer. What were some texts, what were some works of art that helped you get through the writing process?
Yeah, I mean, there's, you could either see them as Easter eggs or shout outs, throughout this book. Stephen King, Shirley Jackson. I was reading a lot of horror, a lot of Gothic type horror, but I read that anyway. Mark Twain is a huge influence on me, in part because he's a Missouri author and, he writes about a lot of places that I've been. There are also some documentaries and stuff I was watching at the time that sort of just freed my mind up. The Raoul Peck documentary, Exterminate All the Brutes, was, really compelling look at brutality and imperialism, but it didn't have a narrative structure. It was really unconventional in the way that it expressed that. And I've always liked things like that. Like one of my favorite movies is 5 Easy Pieces, which is like a character study that has kind of no plot. I mean, it does to me, but a lot of people describe it as having no plot. And that's been my favorite movie since I was 13 years old. And so I've always been attracted to that. I was also watching and rewatching Twin Peaks. I was watching it, all the way through now that it's available on Hulu, and of course that's a very boundary pushing show, and the mysteries of it. I come back to that show a lot because I feel like I haven't untangled it. Peter Straub, who unfortunately died recently, is another person, who was a huge influence on me. His book Ghost Story is a book I've read every year again, because there's that mystery. And so I started really thinking about mystery and the unknowable, because this is a book about conspiracies versus conspiracy theories and what we are willing to believe and how power factors into what we're willing to believe. So, I was reading a lot of Carl Jung because he wrote a lot about that. I mean, it's a really weird book. And then honestly, and Hunter S. Thompson, who's quoted several times in the book, was an influence because he was writing in a time very much like our own in terms of the sheer overt corruption, of the Nixon era. Only he had the satisfaction of actually watching Watergate happen, watch the Church Committee happen, watching the Pike Committee happen, and then he watched it fall apart. And a lot of the essays by him I found really compelling were just collections that he wrote in real time in the 1980s. And I saw all these familiar names in them, like Bill Barr and so forth. And I was like, my God, I've said this for years, but it was more proof that this is just the same stories and the same people over and over again. Like the villains of our childhood, the villains of our 80s childhood are alive now, which is, I think, honestly, one of the reasons Hunter S. Thompson shot himself. You brought up Hemingway. Like Hemingway shot himself. People who witness these awful things and kind of have a deep understanding of them. I mean, they both had, obviously, the two of them had drinking problems. They had gun obsessions, other things going on. But there's a lot of pain there. I think Hunter S. Thompson is someone who's misunderstood. He's known for being wild, for being misogynist. I think there's a lot of soul in that writing. I think the people who try to imitate him, they don't pull it off because they miss the soulfulness and the mourning, the deep sadness that's in all of those devastating, cutting, sarcastic takedowns of American political life. You talked to me privately when I was trying to start writing this book. And at that point in 2021, I had hit what a lot of people call the pandemic wall, where I just felt like my mind wasn't working. I had the worst case of writer's block I'd ever had in my life. And for me, writer's block is the same as depression. Like there isn't a difference. And at that point, when I look back at it, it's like my subconscious had cut off. And in retrospect, it was probably a mercy killing, because I think if I had let myself feel everything that was in my mind, it would have been too much for me. So in retrospect, it's probably good it played out that way and that I didn't start writing until April or May of 2021. But at the time, it felt agonizing because there's so much built up inside you and you can't creatively express it. And then one day, the first line of the book came to me like it does for so many writers while I was taking a shower. And I was like, oh shit, I got to write that down. And I ran out of the shower and I ran into my room and I scrawled it on a piece of paper and then went back and washed the conditioner on my hair. And then I sat down and I started writing. And the first few paragraphs came out and I was kind of like, okay, at least I wrote something. At least I could still write. I don't know if this is very good or not. I guess we'll see where it goes. And, then I just kind of committed myself, like, I'm going to just write 500 words a day, because if I do that, I will meet my deadline. And this is something I was, as gravely concerned would not happen. I did meet my deadline. And as it went on, it got easier, but it is so dark. And we were doing Gaslit Nation at the same time. And I just thought I cannot do what happened with Hiding in Plain Sight, where the subject matter I'm talking about on Gaslit Nation is very similar and sometimes overlapping with the book I'm writing. And it's all incredibly depressing and incredibly upsetting. Like I've got to figure out a way to process this so that I don't end up like Hunter S. Thompson did, or like how Hemingway did. This is getting really personal, but I was worried I was kind of heading in that direction unless I found a way to cope with it. And some things that kept me going were just music. I had this mix. It started out as a mix called Grim 80s, because I was really kind of thinking about all the, we just did our Wilburys Gaslit Nation episodes for 2 months. Andrea and I named all the episodes of Gaslit Nation after traveling Wilbury songs, and one person noticed. Everyone else was just kind of like, okay, sure, Heading for the Light, Dirty World, all right. But anyway, I was thinking about how in the 80s, the boomers, because they dominate everything, when they got old, when they hit 40, they still made songs, and they sang songs about being 40 and being disillusioned and feeling like the world was crumbling around them. And so I started to make a mix of those. It had a lot of Don Henley on it. Don Henley, All She Wants to Do Is Dance, was actually a huge influence on They Knew, because that is a song about Iran-Contra. It's about the Iran-Contra affair. It's about drug running. It's about state corruption. It's about getting away with crimes. And all these other Don Henley songs from the 80s, all these synthed up, danceable, very, very 80s Huey Lewis and the News sound quality songs are the most bitter, Leonard Cohen-like lyrical compositions. And I kept thinking, my God, no one has noticed how dark 80s Don Henley is. So I want to write, maybe in this style, maybe this is the way to do it, is you have, a beat to it, you have a rhythm to it, and you lose people in the rhythm, and then you're able to deliver the devastating truth because everyone is, just mesmerized by the synth pop. in the background. And so that was this very strange kind of inspirational source for me. It's like, man, it's good. You're the only one who's going to get this interview, Andrea. Everyone else seemed to be like, yes, it was Proust. But here, no, the truth is it was 80s Don Henley, big influence. And really, I encourage a critical reexamination of those songs, and not just like End of Innocence and the well-known ones, but other ones. You know, there's a song about trumped up towers with golden showers. And like, it made me, because this is a conspiracy book, I can now say this too. I was listening to that song. I'm not forgetting what it's called, but that's one of the lyrics. And I'm like, did the fucking Trump people, when they were trying to make the Steele dossier inaccurate, because we know the broad outlines of the Steele dossier are true. You know, Trump was a Kremlin asset. He's hooked up to oligarchs. Like, none of that is something that you can contest. The whole, like, did Trump have a prostitute pee on a bed thing, I always found questionable. And now I'm like, did they just like reach into like the Don Henley B-side catalog and grab like those lines and just make some shit up? Kind of wondering, because I feel like Trump is stuck in the late 80s. You know, mentally, he never progressed beyond there. That's why his favorite song is Memory from Cats. And They Knew is also to some degree stuck in the late 80s. You know, there's a lot of 80s crime that I get into, you know, BCCI, the Craig Spence case, et cetera, et cetera. So it felt right to me to have this mix playing in the background that was all dark 80s songs by boomers, you know, like Pressure by Billy Joel, some stuff that was just sort of like moody in the right way, like Moving in Stereo by the Cars, you know, all this kind of shit. Scarecrow by John Cougar Mellencamp. I should post this mix and truly humiliate myself.
You should do the They Knew Spotify.
Oh, God. And my family went insane. They knew the minute because this first song was Moving in Stereo. And so they would hear that. They'd hear those synth chords and like, oh, God. You know, my kids would be like, Mommy's writing. And they just knew, you know, they couldn't go in my room until that thing played through, until that mix was done, because it was like Pavlovian. And now I'm at the point where if any of these songs come on, like if The Boys of Summer comes on, I like mentally go into the state of like wanting to write They Knew or edit They Knew. And so I've had to just turn that off, and hopefully I'll like all these songs again. Right now, I'm so sick of them that if I hear any of the songs from the They Knew mix, I can't listen to them. And I did the same thing with Hiding in Plain Sight, which eventually showed up actually as a apocalypse mix on our show when we were doing the COVID specials, and somebody actually asked us for an apocalypse mix. A lot of that was just what I listened to while writing Hiding in Plain Sight. Anyway, this is a window into the Kensier creative process, which is probably far less inspiring than you'd hoped. But for everyone out there, and I'm serious here, if you're struggling with writer's block at this time, with depression, with trying to take in all the horrible things, and then you're thinking yourself on top of it, oh my God, I have this professional pressure or creative pressure and I can't produce and I'll never get it back. You're not going to like guarantee that you will get it back, but I fully believed that my writing career and life, in my writing life is much more important to me than my career, was over. I felt like I would never write again. I felt like whatever part of my brain sends me into the zone and lets me create these sentences and these paragraphs, I felt like it was gone forever. And I was just devastated. And then it came back. It really did. And I think some of it was like a miracle. Some of it was that sort of magical inspiration feeling, you know, anybody who does creative works does. And then the rest was just being persistent. You know, it was forcing myself to sit there and write it and work through it and process it. And I still think, you know, well, thank God that actually happened. That's how I feel after I write anything. I'm like, oh my God, it's real. It's done. Thank God it still exists and I can still do it, because it doesn't feel completely in my control. And so I guess I just want to extend some comfort to people struggling now, because I've seen this from a lot of creative people during the pandemic, that they felt that same sense of helplessness. And, you know, while I never would wish that on anyone, I would feel better when I'd see some really accomplished writer, somebody who I really admired, saying, you know, for the first time in my life, I'm stuck. Like, I can't do it. I feel burnt out in a way I never have felt before. And then, you know, I rebounded and other folks have rebounded. And it's okay if you're not rebounding. It's okay if you're just taking care of yourself. It's okay if you're giving yourself time, you know, to process, to heal, to rest, whatever. Like, I hope folks do that, because I think if I had just accepted that earlier, if I had said to myself, you know, you need a break, like you need to sort of dial it back a little, and like eventually it will come, you know, have some faith for once, you know, in your life, because I'm not great at that. I wish I had taken care of myself in a positive way. So I guess that's something I want, people to take away from this conversation.
It's beautiful advice. And so good on you for trusting your instincts and being vulnerable, letting it all out there. I think that it totally paid off. The work is, I keep going back to the word rich. It just has such a richness to it. It is such a wonderful, gripping journey. And it's an intimate one. And I think anybody who'd read it would feel like they know you, like I know you. And I think it's just such a essential book to read, to find comfort and guidance, and also just to understand the long, painful history of the United States. And if you understand that, everything we're dealing with now makes so much more sense. And you have a clear idea of where things are headed. So those are all reasons, of course, to read it. And I do want to also commend the team, your editors, your publisher, because you took risks, you took creative risks. You put your beautiful, shining so-called freak flag out there, as we all should as creative people. And they didn't try to, as far as I understood, because you would have complained to me otherwise. But they trusted you too. And I think that is such a testament to them too, because sometimes when you have collaborators, they might get too scared, or they might be fiercely generic, or they might just have bad taste. And you weren't held back, it seems, by any of that. And you were allowed the freedom to express yourself. And it's obviously clearly to everyone's benefit now.
That is true. And, that is something I worried about. My editor, we'll give her a shout out, Bryn Clark. She edited Hiding in Plain Sight. She's great. When you have an editor, it's a weird thing. Like, even if you don't meet that person in real life very much, in some sense, they know you better than a lot of people you actually see in your life, because they're seeing your thought process. They're seeing rough drafts of your thoughts, the things that you present to the public in a polished form. So there's a lot of vulnerability there. So of course I sit there thinking, please understand me, like, please understand who I am and what I'm trying to do. And I was just incredibly relieved that she did not at all hold me back from, the creative risks in the book, that she did understand what I was going for. And of course she had suggestions and comments and everything. And that's great. That's what an editor is supposed to do. But yeah, I didn't feel constrained. I was very worried also about legal review, because I think I could talk about this now to a degree. Like, Hiding in Plain Sight, as you recall, Andrea, from our private conversations, was a very unpleasant legal review. I did not do anything wrong. I've never had to issue a retraction. I've never had anything proved to be wrong. I've never been sued, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of worry about my descriptions of various mafiosos and oligarchs. And there's a lot of, the lawyer language, like a lot of allegedlys and, Felix Sater having to be described as a, quote, mafia adjacent actor instead of the word that I had used. And whatever, I don't want to be sued. Obviously, I also don't want to be murdered. Some of that is understandable, but then there is another incident, which I'm not going to get into, but there is a time period I thought, this book is not coming out. They're going to kill it at the last minute, and it's just not going to come out. It was a very stressful situation. That did not happen this time, possibly because most of the people they knew are dead. So, important lesson to you, go ahead and make a cross stitch of this and hang it on your wall. The dead can't sue. But I also, I did not want to go back into, hi, I'm writing about the mafia again. Yeah, I mean, I did, anyway, but not as much, because it was really scary. So yeah, I was so grateful that they let me have that kind of creative freedom. I'm really relieved this morning. We should say we're taping this, I don't even know what day it is, September 9th. And the first excerpt of it that anyone has seen ran in Vanity Fair today. And so far the response has been really positive, and it's just a profound relief, because in my mind I'm thinking, oh my God, people are gonna hate this, or they'll be expecting something and they're gonna get this weird story about a ghost hotel in Arkansas instead. And I'm just I'm relieved. So yeah, like I hope folks, if you work in publishing, I hope you, if you see other weird authors living in places where authors aren't supposed to live, like Missouri and whatnot, take a chance on them, please, because there's a lot of talent out there, a lot of like unconventional thinkers who don't, I think, get the kind of platforms and attention that they should, the kind that I have now, whereas a lot of really cookie cutter, Matt Iglesias types, I'm sorry, I don't mean to name a specific person, but it's like he really embodies this, who are just saying what people who are powerful and wealthy want to hear. and live in New York and come from very famous, prestigious families and whatnot, they do get all this attention. And it deprives the American public of a range of perspectives, and it deprives culture of creativity. Like, we've had so many great, wonderful, creative eras in American history, a lot of it coming from like a counterculture that is in opposition to a monoculture. And now we've lost the monoculture, which I do discuss that in the we've kind of lost the counterculture, or at least it doesn't get the kind of push. People put out really unique and imaginative things, and then it's not seen because of algorithms, because of corporations, and so on. So I hope folks see that my weird little books are also commercially viable, and that they lend their support to other people's weird little books. That would make me really happy.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
Pakistan has been decimated by record floods, and people need help. To help the victims of the floods, donate to Pakistan Emergency Flood Aid at www.launchgood.com/campaign/Pakistan_emergency_flood_aid. Climate and economic crises are everywhere, so please consider supporting your local food bank as well.
We encourage you to help support Ukraine by donating to Razom for Ukraine at razomforukraine.org. We also encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Ukraine, Syria, and Afghanistan. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going.
Our production manager is Nicholas Torres, and our associate producer is Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Bissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher. Jess Sauer,
Chick Quinn,
Lily Wachowski,
Sean Rubin,
Todd S. Pearlstein,
Kenny Main,
John Schoenthaler,
Ellen McGirt,
Joel Ferran,
Larry Gasson,
Erica Moore,
Karen A. Deal,
Nico Phillips,
Brian E. Castor,
Tatjana Birch,
Karen Heisler,
Ann Bertino,
Chris Bravo,
T.R. Dunstan,
John Millette,
David East,
Stu,
Shannon Nacy,
Ida,
Ben Wheaton,
Joseph Mara Jr.,
Rich Holcomb,
Thomas Scheibe,
Kelsey Molsom,
Julie Matthews,
Meganopolis,
Barbara Kittredge,
Matthew Womack,
Silas Frank,
Sean Berg,
Kristen Custer,
Tracy Ash,
Kai Gillis,
Sharon Hattrick,
William Barry Reeves,
Richard Smith,
Emmy,
Kevin Gannon,
Mike Christensen,
Sandra Collins,
Katie Masuris,
John Laughlin,
James D. Leonard,
Leo Chalupa,
Carol Gulstad,
Michael Woldridge,
Jason Benke,
Marcus J. Trent,
Joe Darcy,
Ann Marshall,
Jeremy Lewis,
Joel Newman,
Trigve,
D.L. Singfield,
Matt Perez,
Nicole Spear,
Brian Tajuden,
Maureen Murphy,
Abby Road,
Jans Alstrup Rasmussen,
Victoria Olson,
Z.W.,
Lisa LaFlame,
Kathy Kavanaugh,
Sarah Gray,
Mike Tripico,
Diana Gallagher,
Jennifer Ann Luter,
John Ripley,
Ethan Mann,
David Porter,
Kate Cotton,
Leah Campbell,
Lynn Schneider,
Jared Lombardo,
Karen Humphreys.
and Tanya Chalupa.
Thank you all for your support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.